There are certain things, certain people, who must be seen to be believed. In the summer of 1979, in a packed courtroom in Dade County, Florida, that person was a 32-year-old law school dropout named Theodore Robert Bundy. Though he'd be the first to tell someone, especially a young woman he lured into getting inside his Volkswagen Beetle, please, you can just call him Ted. In that summer of 1979, Ted Bundy was on trial for the murder of two college students, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman and her sorority sister, 20-year-old Lisa Levy. But these college students were just two in a violent and vicious killing spree that lasted at least 4 years, taking the lives of anywhere from 18 to 36 people. Nobody knew for sure. Nobody ever would. Ted Bundy wasn't the first serial killer saga to captivate Americans' attention. By 1979, the American public had become familiar with the mass murderer. Serial killers like Richard Speck and Charles Manson, the Hillside Strangler, Tampa's Red Light District Strangler, the Pied Piper of Tucson, the Texas Tower Sniper, the Boston Strangler, and New York City's Son of Sam. And tragically, earlier that year, in the winter of 1979, there was the first school shooting in the United States when a 16-year-old girl named Brenda Spencer opened fire on an elementary school in San Diego, killing 2 adults at the scene and wounding 8 children. And when asked why she committed this crime, Brenda Spencer reportedly, famously, said, "I don't like Mondays." By the time of his trial, Ted Bundy was already infamous, his name and face plastered all over the newspapers. But Ted Bundy's murder trial was the first to ever be broadcast live on national television. And for the millions watching, this was the first time they were able to see a psychopath, a real psychopathic serial killer right there in front of them on screen in their very own living rooms. And well, when Ted Bundy made his television debut, appearing on camera as both defendant and attorney, as Ted Bundy largely represented himself at this trial, those watching, especially women, they couldn't believe it. Could it be true that this seemingly nice guy, intelligent and charismatic and handsome in a boy-next-door kind of way, was it possible he did all those terrible things to all those innocent people? Smart, ambitious young women and teenage girls whose lives were brutally cut short by a guy who looks like he belongs on a 1970s box of Grecian formula? As the New York Times put it, Ted Bundy didn't look like a serial killer. He looked like a Kennedy. And at that time, the general consensus was, if Ted Bundy could be a twisted and depraved serial predator, it seemed like anyone could. In that summer in 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty of those murders and more, and a judge sentenced him to death. For many, the death penalty was justice. For others, especially in the field of forensic psychology, his death sentence was a warning. Psychopaths may only be a fraction of the world's population, but the death and destruction these individuals can cause can have a catastrophic impact on the rest of us. And the idea was the only way you could stop killers like Ted Bundy is by treating them like the human tumor that they are. Identify them early, carve them out of society, and destroy them before they grow, before they spread. But how? That was the question. These individuals who disguised their darkest impulses with no conscience, no sense of remorse, a gleeful joy in other people's misery and pain, who blended in among us. What hope did we have of protecting ourselves if we couldn't detect them. It was a dangerous dilemma of which there was no solution. But just a year later, in 1980, a Canadian forensic psychologist named Robert Hare would have the answer. A checklist with a list of warning signs he believed were unique to psychopaths. He called it the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, better known these days as the Psychopath Test. A handy-dandy, easy-to-follow list of 20 possible signs that someone is a psychopath. And this test has been deployed in sussing out psychopaths, from scary serial killers to self-important CEOs. And now, the Psychopath Test is once again making headlines for its controversial role, a small piece of a much larger puzzle, of a death penalty case, of a now 58-year-old father, Robert Roberson, who was scheduled to die by lethal injection today as I record this, October 16th, 2025. Unlike Ted Bundy, who fought his death penalty conviction and lost, Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair in 1989. Those who support Robert Roberson successfully arranged a stay of execution at the very last minute. And what's drawn people together is not a debate over whether or not the death penalty is right or wrong, but the urgent concern that an innocent man is destined to die for a crime he did not commit. Robert Roberson has been on death row in Texas for 22 years, since the jury found him guilty in the death of his young daughter, 2-year-old Nikki, back in 2003. The cause of death was shaken baby syndrome. Now, all these years later, his supporters, which includes a diverse group from the original detective on the case to Dr. Phil McGraw to both Republican and Democratic lawmakers in Texas, claiming that he himself was a victim, that this was all a tragic accident. A conviction drawn from junk science, that's shaken baby syndrome, and junk psychology. That is, the prosecution's expert who diagnosed Robert Roberson as a psychopath. Psychopathy, according to the experts, was not even really a disease, but an antisocial behavioral disorder for which there was no cure. No, the only appropriate treatment for a psychopath like Robert Roberson was death. And those who followed this case, along with his supporters, believe that it was this designation that Robert Roberson was proved to be a psychopath that informed the severity of his punishment. And they maintain, for reasons you'll hear about later in this episode, that Robert Roberson is innocent and is in no way a psychopath. So what do his supporters want? A new trial. Will they get it? That is unclear. But as this case once again dominates the headlines, for this episode we are going to revisit the Psychopath Test, the test's history and origins, and its unexpected and outsized influence in determining the outcome of criminal cases and beyond. And as part of this episode, you'll even be able to fatigue your own mind by taking the test yourself. This is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller. Thank you for joining me. And as Dead Sleep approaches its 2-year anniversary, I want to say thank you to everyone who has so enthusiastically supported this show. Thank you for the comments, for the really helpful feedback, for following the show, and thank you to the people who subscribe and ensure Dead Sleep's success moving forward. If you would like to be one of those people who subscribes to this show and ensures its success for $5 a month, you can do so via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. A special thanks to John Ronson, who wrote a book called The Psychopath Test. And we covered another story by John Ronson in the previous episode called Mystery at the Chateau. And in that episode, I actually touched upon John Ronson's book and the Psychopath Test, but I took it out for timing and for space. But then when I saw this Robert Roberson case in the headlines and the mention of the Psychopath Test on top of a new podcast called Last Appeal about Robert Roberson's case that is hosted by none other than Lester Holt of NBC News and Dateline fame, well, it seems like an appropriate time to revisit the Psychopath Test. This is, of course, the dead sleep version of events, a story that is transformed for appropriate nighttime listening, which means no depictions of graphic violence, but plenty of other dense details to exhaust the mind. And just quickly, because you might be hearing a lot about this case, there are those who say Robert Roberson and those who say Robert Roberson. I am choosing the pronunciation Roberson because that is how those who are closest to the case pronounce his name. Robert Roberson. But in other podcasts and other stories, you will hear Roberson. Just putting that out there so that no one gets distracted or annoyed by this pronunciation. So with that, at long last, let's settle back in. And we're going to travel back in time. Way back in time, a few years before Ted Bundy was even born. 1941. When the United States officially joined its European allies, waging war against Japan, Italy, and Germany. It was a war that no one in the United States, or much of the world, actually wanted. A second world war that would destroy the lives of millions. And yet, World War II would be ultimately defined by one man who was unlike anything anyone in the 20th century had ever seen before. The German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. A dictator, a fascist Führer, who did not seem to have a conscience or feelings of sympathy, empathy, remorse, or guilt. He was an oddly charismatic, incorrigible force who seemed determined to achieve two things: annihilation and world domination. And part of the 1930s and 40s was trying to understand what made this malevolent mind tick, and how could he be stopped? Back then, we only had a rudimentary vocabulary to describe these types of people. Good or evil, sane or insane. But that very same year in 1941, a book would be published that would change everything. And this book, it was published by a groundbreaking American psychiatrist named Dr. Hervey Cleckley. This influential book, titled The Mask of Sanity, is credited with the whole popularization and understanding of the psychopath personality. And in fact, it's the clunky subtitle of this book that conveys just how difficult defining a psychopath can be. The full title of Dr. Cleckley's book is The Mask of Sanity, an attempt to clarify some issues about the so-called psychopathic personality. Now, Dr. Cleckley didn't discover the existence of psychopaths. There's evidence suggesting the recognition of this personality disorder dating back thousands of years. In ancient Greece, there are depictions of amoral, unscrupulous individuals described as empty souls. And this understanding of a person who experienced a soulless emptiness, it evolved as the field of psychiatry developed. And this understanding that there were individuals who had empty souls, this notion evolved as the field of psychiatry developed in the 1800s. What was so important about what Dr. Cleckley did back in the 1940s and in future editions that he published was identify and clarify what a psychopath was. And in his book, he featured several men and a few women who appeared charming, intelligent, and rational, but lacked the ability to form emotional connections and didn't appear to feel guilt or shame. And while even today, psychopaths are not listed specifically in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM, it's considered a subset of a diagnosis known as antisocial personality disorder. The thing was, what Dr. Cleckley and others have noticed, is that one could easily detect an antisocial personality, but the psychopath, there was a twist. Without new diagnostic tools to recognize these psychopathic personalities, they were very difficult to detect. So Cleckley was the first, or at least the most influential, in developing behavioral criteria in diagnosing a psychopathic personality. And in 1979, the elderly Dr. Cleckley even weighed in on Ted Bundy's case, establishing that yes, Ted Bundy was indeed a psychopath, but he was able to stand trial. And Cleckley's diagnostic tools included a 16-point list of signs, of symptoms of a possible psychopath. And Cleckley's work would go on to influence a prominent Canadian psychologist named Dr. Robert Hare. And when the elderly Cleckley passed away in the 1980s, it was Bob Hare who would emerge as the foremost expert in psychopathic diagnosis. And in 1984, Robert Hare published a book, which included his 20-point checklist to determine if someone was a psychopath. And the crucial distinction between Dr. Hare's work and the earlier work of Dr. Cleckley was Dr. Cleckley's book, The Mask of Sanity, was really intended for his colleagues, those who were in the psychiatric community, to help them identify, diagnose, and figure out how to treat psychopaths. But with Dr. Hare, his 20-point checklist would become the gold standard for identifying psychopathic personalities, and by the 1990s was widely used by law enforcement and those in criminal psychology to help identify possible psychopaths as these difficult individuals made their way through the criminal justice system. The desire for this determination, it made sense. According to some studies, the so-called average psychopaths are much more likely to be repeat offenders than non-psychopaths. And according to one study, the average incarcerated psychopath has been convicted of committing 4 violent offenses before age 40. And even though it is still unclear how one becomes a psychopath, is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it neurons? We still aren't sure. Psychopaths are still seen as individuals who lack moral cognition. And this inherent personality defect is untreatable. Now, in the 1960s, there were some extreme attempts to try and figure out a way to treat and cure psychopaths. And some of these experiments were pretty wild. From giving incarcerated psychopaths LSD, then locking them all together in a room while they're tripping, naked, to using strong electrical currents to zap psychopaths and test their reaction. Average people, when they anticipate electric shock, they flinch. Psychopaths, on the other hand, don't experience fear or worry. They don't break a sweat. Now, by 2003, right around the time Robert Roberson's case was going to trial, a new version of the Hare psychopathy checklist had been released. And that's the version you're going to hear right now. And after each item, a person is given a score. 1, if they mildly relate, and 2 means the maximum. The highest score that one can get in the psychopath test is 40. But the cutoff point, that is the number that you can get and still be considered in psychopathic territory, well, it's different in different countries. In the United States, the score is 30. In the UK, it's 25. So what you're about to hear, in a very dead sleep fashion, are the 20 items from Hare's psychopath checklist. And to be clear, this is just the checklist. In a real-life setting, there would be actual questions that would tease out someone's psychopathic traits, and ideally performed by a trained clinician. But here is the slow-moving, dead sleep version of all 20 traits. 1. Glibness and superficial charm. 2. Grandiose sense of self-worth. 3. Need for stimulation, proneness to boredom. 4. Pathological lying. 5. Cunning and manipulative. 6. Lack of remorse or guilt. 7. Shallow affect. That means a flat personality. 8. Callous, lack of empathy. 9. A parasitic lifestyle. 10. Poor behavioral controls. 11. Promiscuous sexual behavior. 12. Early behavior problems. 13. Lack of realistic long-term goals. 14. Impulsivity. 15. Irresponsibility. 16. Failure to accept responsibility for own actions. 17. Many short-term marital relationships. 18. Juvenile delinquency. 19. Revocation of conditional release. 20. Criminal versatility. Now, again, each of these is rated on a scale, 0, 1, and 2. 2 being the highest, of course. 0, it does not apply at all. 1, it kind of fits. And 2, that it's consistent with the offender. And note that word offender, because that is the most controversial part of the psychopath test. In 1991, Robert Hare agreed to sell his test, and this test was sold to members of law enforcement, prisons, parole boards, and courts. And over the next 10 years, certainly by the time that Robert Roberson was standing trial, this test had proliferated and become so widely used that it's almost impossible to track how it was used, if it was used correctly, and most important, if it was indeed successful in identifying psychopaths. Some suggest that its overuse, makes the Hare test about as reliable as a BuzzFeed quiz. It has been and still is considered the so-called gold standard. And in 2003, this test was respected and considered credible enough that in 2003, in Robert Roberson's case, the prosecution's expert witness was a psychologist who declared Robert Roberson as a psychopath. He even drew comparisons between Robert Roberson to Hitler and Saddam Hussein and Ted Bundy, including the observation that when police came to his house at a time when the average father would likely be crying and grieving, Robert Roberson was making a sandwich. In fact, everything about Robert Roberson seemed disconnected. And based on the hair checklist, the one that everybody used, it seemed reasonable to deduce that Robert was a psychopath. And even prison wasn't going far enough to keep people safe. Robert's score was 34. He was a malevolent mind, a dangerous criminal, and if they did not take care of him, he would kill again. The recommendation for this incurable psychopath, well, it could only be one thing: the death penalty. And it was this label that Robert's supporters believe stained him in the eyes of the jury, and therefore they handed down the most extreme punishment you can get. But what everybody missed, until many years later, was a whole other possibility. That Robert Roberson was not a psychopath. What he was, really, according to his supporters, was an undiagnosed adult with autism. And it is that diagnosis that is more crucial to understanding Robert Roberson's case, and his defenders say, establish his innocence. Looking at a handful of the items on that psychopath test, you could see an overlap between autism and psychopathic behavior. From appearing to have a shallow affect, a measure of impulsivity or irresponsibility. And on top of that, his supporters say, when stressed, all of those behaviors are further exaggerated. This includes Robert Roberson's decision to make a sandwich in the middle of a police investigation. Now, it's been established that the psychological expert who determined that Robert Roberson was indeed a psychopath, he did use the hair checklist. But what they don't know, nobody does, are the questions he asked, what that interview was like, or how Robert responded, because audio or transcripts of that interview are not available. And in the years since Robert Roberson's case was decided and that he was sent to death row, criticism has been building around the hair psychopath test about how often it's relied on by so-called experts who are making these diagnoses, and at the same time, the test by any measure is pretty subjective, and it's often performed by people who are not trained experts, who have no training in forensic criminal psychology. Furthermore, as a tool that is often used by the prosecution, the psychopath test only really exists to further support the guilt of a suspect, not clarify any of their needs for treatment or otherwise. And because psychopathy has been determined to be incurable, to those who are found guilty of a crime, this label of psychopath is for many a death sentence. And a new book that came out this past summer is a direct challenge to Dr. Cleckley's work with psychopaths and a rejection of the whole so-called diagnosis of psychopathy. In a book titled Psychopathy Unmasked: The Rise and Fall of a Dangerous Diagnosis, author Rasmus Rosenberg Larsen claims that this test in particular has resulted in a misdiagnosis and a misuse of people who are not psychopaths at all. But the consequences of a misdiagnosis in courts and prisons can be devastating. And even those tasked with performing the psychopath test, especially those who aren't actually trained clinicians, they're relying on pop culture references to serial killers, stuff they've seen in movies and on TV, affirming something you already believe from looking at that person, maybe comparing them with someone from a movie, that it's not really about a psychopath test as much as it is confirmation bias. In a review of court records by the Marshall Project, they found more than a dozen death sentences that were handed down in cases as far back as 1998 that involved court testimony based on the Hare psychopathy checklist. But as the Marshall Project notes, since no one tracks these cases in a comprehensive way, it's possible there are far more. And even for those who were convicted of a crime and labeled a psychopath but not given the death penalty, having that psychopath label in one's file often prevents them from being released by the parole board because of this supposition that psychopaths will always be repeat offenders and that their condition is incurable. Now, for those in the trenches, people in law enforcement, those who work in the criminal justice system, being able to diagnose and determine that someone is a psychopath is a legitimate way to ensure that you can put them away as a means of keeping the public safe. But the question that's a big part of Robert Roberson's case is what happens when that diagnosis is wrong. Or maybe the better question is, can the psychopath test ever really be right? Let's take the case of Adolf Hitler. The expert in Robert Roberson's case compared him to a psychopath like Hitler. But those who claim to have really studied the psychology of Hitler, they'll say he's not a psychopath. He was a narcissist. He had borderline personality disorder and a whole other host of other serious mental problems. But they'd argue Hitler was not a psychopath because he did have intimate relationships along with a host of other things that don't align with the psychopath checklist. But does that mean that Robert Roberson was worse than Hitler? Of course not. But it underscores the hazards of what happens when you try and chart a person's entire future based on a 20-point checklist. As for Bob Hare, he doesn't see himself as responsible for promoting this false test. He sees it as a tool. And how people decide to use and interpret his tool is up to them. And even Bob Hare himself has extended the psychopath checklist. He wrote an entire book called Snakes in Suits that highlighted just how many corporate CEOs are actually high-functioning psychopaths. And their victims are the customers, the clients, the employees who must serve them. As I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, labeling Robert Roberson a psychopath was just one piece of a bigger puzzle. But the more recent diagnosis suggesting Robert Roberson is actually on the spectrum, that is a potential game changer, or at least a very persuasive argument against the psychopath diagnosis. But that is not what is being used by his supporters as an argument to grant him a new trial. Their hope is based on a law that was passed in 2013 in the state of Texas. In 2013, the state of Texas passed something called a junk science law. And what follows is taken verbatim from the Texas Bar Association's website. It's the first state in the entire country to provide a specific legal avenue allowing prisoners to challenge potential wrongful convictions by showing that changes in the field of forensic science either seriously undermine the integrity of the criminal trials resulting in their convictions, or else exonerated the prisoner completely. And those who support Robert Roberson say that shaken baby syndrome, which again has been questioned by medical experts, qualifies as junk science. They believe that shaken baby syndrome is right up there with other questionable forensic methods, from bite marks to blood spatter analysis. Now, this junk science law, in theory, is an incredible opportunity for someone who believes they were wrongly convicted of a crime to have their case revisited on weak evidence. But it's still a long and challenging process, which means this case is not going to be resolved anytime soon. But I strongly recommend checking out Lester Holt's podcast, which goes into a lot of detail about that case, and far more comprehensive coverage of shaken baby syndrome and how it's now been determined as junk science. Which brings us back to Ted Bundy, and whether or not there is a way to tell whether or not a person is good or evil, sane or insane, a psychopath, a serial killer. And so far, there is one person who says her method is foolproof. The writer Ann Rule, who, as you know, wrote The Stranger Beside Me, which is essentially a biography of Ted Bundy. And we actually did 3 episodes on the life and career of Ann Rule, which are worth revisiting if you haven't heard them in a while. But as you might recall, Ann Rule was friends with Ted Bundy for years without suspecting he was a serial killer or a psychopath. She hadn't a clue. But she would later say there was a sign, one she ignored. Ann Rule remembered that the only being in her life who did not like Ted Bundy was her dog. And Ann Rule said her dog loved everyone. But anytime that Ted Bundy came around, anytime he got too close to Ann, the dog would bark and growl and get her hackles up. And looking back, Ann Rule would later wonder, why didn't she pay attention to her dog? And Ann Rule's takeaway from that experience is good advice for just about everyone. When in doubt, trust your dog. Thank you so much for listening and for your patience as I quickly put this episode together to have it ready in time for this week. I will be back next week with a longer, more in-depth episode, another story of survival that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. So be sure to follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.